Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Linda, so much for that warm welcome. It is such an honor to be with you today and to share some thoughts about building healthy rural communities. I know that this is a passion that I share with so many of you in this room. And as you gather over these 2 days here in Atlanta to learn and to build new relationships and share thoughts about promising practices, I'm so grateful to have a chance to learn from your conversations and to better understand the needs of the small towns and the rural communities in which each of you serve. Dr. Pardue, I want to start by commending the University of Georgia for putting on, under your leadership, for hosting an event to address the incredibly challenging issue of stress in rural America. I think back to what feels like just a couple of weeks ago, but I know it's been much longer than that. But several months ago, you were not long in your role as your position as dean, and we talked about you recognizing early that this was an issue in rural America that you might want to tackle. And I look at the attendance list, the states that are represented here, the organizations and the interests, and I think that that certainly validates your wisdom. In addition to the need, I am grateful for the leadership at UGA for holding an event like this, because from what I have seen, it is conversations like what this venue allows that are critically important for erasing the stigma that is often so prevalent in communities, but particularly in rural communities around mental health. Whether we're talking about depression or anxiety, suicide, or the topic of substance misuse, including opioids, stigma can pose a monumental barrier to a family or to an individual in getting help. And I believe strongly that it is only when we have a dialogue like this and we give people permission, if you will, to talk about what is really going on, either for themselves, for their family, or in their community, or for their neighbor, that we can truly change the narrative in a town and build the tools that are needed really to change the direction in someone's life or in a community from darkness to light. Perhaps like many of you that are here this week, I come to this challenge with many questions myself. But I do have some lessons that I've learned in my own journey working on the issue of opioid misuse in rural communities over the past year. And I look forward to sharing some of that wisdom tonight, along with some of the specific things that we are doing at the Department of Agriculture under the leadership of Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue to address this issue. I'm optimistic that while my comments are going to focus on what we're doing specific to opioids, that much of what we have learned, these tools, if you will, can be applied to the broader challenge of rural stress. Before I turn to that work, I do want to share a difficult but powerful story that frames up what I see as the real world impact of our collective focus on mental health in rural America. Earlier this year, this fall, I was asked to speak to a large group of farmers about our activity at Rural Development. They had come to DC as part of a fly-in for a major farm organization. The room was packed. I think there was probably 300 folks in the room. And I was the last to speak of a long set of speakers from the sub-cabinet. I finished my time that morning with enough opportunity for some discussion, and so when we opened up the floor for some questions, I answered questions about water quality, conservation programs, broadband, renewable fuels, everything you would expect. And then there was a woman who stood up who had the last question of the day. And for purposes of this story, I'll simply call her Mary. Standing tall that morning, Mary spoke softly, but she had a purpose. She stood and told me that she was from Iowa, and without any hesitation in her voice, she told me that she was grateful for our leadership on the opioid crisis because her husband had killed himself in February of that year, leaving her to manage the farm. And with that message delivered, Mary sat down. And in that silence, you could have heard a pin drop in that auditorium. And I certainly was left with no words and little breath Of all of the questions that Mary could have asked me in front of 300 of her peers, that was not a topic that I would ever anticipate in that setting. To this day, Mary's comments ring through my mind and through my heart. Her courage to stand in front of that size of an audience of her peers and to share her family's story keeps me focused both on the gravity of this issue and on the importance of all of us working together as agriculture and rural leaders to ensure that rural Americans who are struggling have access to the resources that they need to be healthy. With its impact and its complexity, this issue is certainly daunting and will take each of us, and I think the networks that all of us represent, working together to solve. However, working together, I do believe that we have an enormous opportunity, albeit forged in the challenge of crisis, that this presents to enable us to do things in a different way and to build healthy rural communities for the future. At Rural Development, our core mission under the leadership of Secretary of Agriculture Perdue is to be a partner in creating prosperity in rural America. So with that mission, we are particularly engaged in helping local leaders respond to one facet of rural stress, the misuse of opioids in rural communities. This issue is a top priority for our president and for the Trump administration. And while it has impacted all of America, we have certainly seen rural places that have been especially hard hit. In late November, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, reported that last year over 70,000 Americans died as a result of a drug overdose, many of those deaths due to the misuse of opioids. In 2017, 10% of the 47,000 suicides that were reported happened because of drugs. And again, we know that many of those deaths stem from the misuse of opioids. I know there's been discussion about suicide today, and we think about the suicide rates in rural areas being nearly twice as high as the deaths in urban centers. And the number of deaths related to fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid, continue to rise in rural communities. Beyond the CDC numbers, we're incredibly grateful for the work of the American Farm Bureau organization. I see Ray has joined us here today. Thank you for the leadership of this organization on this issue. In addition to Farm Bureau, the Farmers Union came together to do a survey last fall that many of you may be familiar with that found that nearly half of all rural adults and 74% of farmers have been directly impacted by opioid misuse. And in October of this past year, another survey that I think is particularly telling came from Harvard University, said that rural Americans, a majority of rural Americans had identified drug addiction, including opioid misuse, as the biggest challenge facing their community. So when we think about that impact, we know that we cannot talk about building strong rural communities without addressing this issue. For the third year in a row, the life expectancy in this country is declining, in large part due to the opioid epidemic. Beyond taking individual lives, we can step back and think about the impact that this crisis is having on worker productivity, increasing the healthcare demands that we have in rural America, and putting enormous stress on what are often already limited resources for emergency response, law enforcement, and social services. Beyond the impact on rural America, USDA is tackling this issue because we are well positioned to help leaders build an effective local response. With the leadership of our state rural development directors, I see Joyce White has joined us here today, our tremendous leader here in Georgia. Thank you, Joyce, for being here. We understand the unique challenges of meeting the needs of rural communities, challenges such as inadequate access to treatment services, lack of broadband connectivity, and the sheer physical isolation that exists in so many rural communities across our country. We not only have the resources to address many of these challenges, but we have field-based staff who live in these communities, work in these places. Many of them have grown up there, and they are able to work hand in hand with local leaders in building an effective local solution. Because no two rural communities are the same, we believe that the most effective solutions really lie at that local level. So our role at USDA is then to be a partner to those local leaders in helping build a solution that they know will work given the strengths and weaknesses of their town. So to do that, we're taking action really on three fronts. First, building infrastructure for prevention, treatment, and recovery, facilitating partnerships, and then driving innovation in rural communities. Let me start a bit about our work in infrastructure. Here we have a number of programs that can be used for prevention, treatment, and recovery needs in rural communities. We were most fortunate that Congress substantially increased the funding for several of those programs during this past fiscal year, and we really wasted no time in putting these dollars to work. In the area of telemedicine, we have a program that can help connect rural areas to treatment and counseling resources as well as prevention education. This is through our distance learning and telemedicine program. In 2018, we gave priority to opioid-related projects, and here we're able to invest around $18 million to establish these remote connections that can be a lifeline to medical care in 68 communities across 33 states. In addition to telemedicine, we have an opportunity to help communities with facilities, with vehicles and equipment. We can do this through our community facilities program. And in 2018, again, we set aside some dollars specifically for projects that would assist a community with opioid misuse. We were able to invest around $11 million in 22 states, 85 projects. Here we did everything from mobile health service vehicles to medical equipment for treatment clinics, and we were able to do some work in transition housing as well. In addition to those grants, we were able to do around $1 billion in loan funds to improve access to rural health care, and many of those projects included assistance with substance misuse and mental health. We were also able to improve public safety facilities in several rural communities, which are so important when there are illegal drugs involved, and helping our law enforcement better prepare a healthy community. Here, those dollars will serve nearly 8 million rural Americans. Finally, in the area of infrastructure, transition housing is an issue that we hear about in so many rural communities. And so here we've been able to really explore what are some of the creative options that we have using some of the assets and the programs in USDA. For example, we have a number of vacant foreclosure homes that come back to us as a result of loans that were not successful through our single-family housing program. And here we have been able to find a way to help get those into the hands of nonprofit organizations that are working with individuals in drug treatment and recovery. In August, we had an exciting partnership that we launched with the Isaiah House, and this is a faith-based organization in Kentucky. They help men with drug and alcohol misuse, and we were able to sell 2 of our foreclosure homes to them, which they then worked with their clients to repurpose into transition housing. It's a great success story. Transition housing needed in 2 rural counties in eastern Kentucky. It helped reuse an asset from a USDA program. It helped to provide workforce development for the men that were involved in rehabbing the property. And then lastly, provides transition housing in a community that very much needs it. So we're now focused on looking how we can support our other state rural development directors in replicating similar transactions in their states. Beyond those specific program investments, if you will, we are building tools to better equip many of our local leaders with information about the available resources and the data that they need to make data-based decisions. In February, we launched an opioids webpage on the USDA website, and there local leaders can find information about our programs at USDA and how to apply. They will also find many news updates and links to the resources of our partners, such as the American Farm Bureau and the National Rural Health Association. One of the things that's featured on the webpage that we've gotten a lot of support for is an interactive feature. It's a map called What's Working in Your Town. And here, as people let us know about things that have been successful in their own communities, we've been able to populate an interactive map that someone can go on to, click on their state, and see what others have suggested are model practices and are working in communities on the ground. And then lastly, in October, we launched a community asset tool. And here, users can go on and look at county by county data about what's going on in their community with respect to drug overdoses. And they can overlay that with socioeconomic data at that local level, at a county level. And that can help them determine, again, as local leaders looking at where to make their investments, what might be some of the things that is driving the crisis in their community. And with better information, they are better equipped to make those data-based decisions that we know are so important to building effective strategies at a local level. In addition to infrastructure, we are facilitating the development of partnerships at the federal, state, and local level to see how we can better leverage the resources that we have to assist rural communities in this fight. Within the federal family, we are working particularly closely with HHS, the SAMHSA agency, as well as HRSA and the Indian Health Service. We're working with the Department of Justice and the Department of Transportation to tackle specific needs that we have seen in rural communities with respect to access to treatment, transition housing, drug courts, and transportation to get to the services that many people need. For example, on Thursday, we're going to be joining the Department of Justice in Tennessee to host a convening of 40 rural judges and sheriffs, a mix of 20 and 20, that Department of Justice has identified as potential candidates to stand up a drug court infrastructure in their community. We know that this is a model that's been incredibly successful in urban areas and is something that we hope could be successful in a rural community to address this issue. Beyond those targeted partnerships, we have worked with the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or otherwise known as ONDCP, to create a rural opioids interagency working group. This has representatives from many agencies across the federal family with resources for rural America, everything from the VA to labor and education. And the goal of this group is how can we better coordinate what often becomes silos of funding to address substance misuse, and then define where those gaps are for future action. In November, we released the first product, if you will, from this work group. It's a federal rural resource guide. It's a very comprehensive overview of all of the federal resources that are available. Right now, unfortunately, it's in a PDF form, but that will evolve into a website that will enable a user to go on and look at something that they're looking for, click on a link, and then be taken to where those resources might be. Outside of government, we are certainly focused on convening our rural and agriculture partners, again, to help break down the silos and build relationships around this issue. Each month, we host a rural partners meeting. Ray is a regular attendee from American Farm Bureau. And again, the idea here is that we want to provide a forum where people who are all working to help rural communities through this issue of stress can come together and share what they are doing and see where there might be places to better coordinate or to build new relationships. This group includes everyone from American Farm Bureau to the National Sheriff's Association, National Association of Counties, Rural Health Association. We started this group in April, and our attendance has been robust and has continued to grow in terms of the diversity of interests that are represented. And then lastly, I think when we talk about partnerships, it's so important to look outside of Washington and look at what we're doing throughout all 50 states, thanks to the leadership of our state rural development directors. There, our state directors are coordinating many of the programs that we have with what is going on at the state and local level in their communities. We have also been able to make those linkages with the regional offices for many of our federal agency partners like SAMHSA and the HRSA agency within HHS. And finally, in addition to infrastructure and to partnerships, we are focused on innovation. here, what can we do to drive innovation through the identification of model practices? Certainly, while no two communities are the same, we know that in many situations, there are things going on in those communities that are similar. And so how can we empower local leaders with information about what we've seen working in other rural places that they might be able to then look at adapting to respond at that local level? Since March, in order to find those model practices, USDA has convened or co-led rural roundtable discussions in 16 states across the country, from Utah to Maine. Just last Tuesday, we had a convening in Washington State. Many of these conversations have been led by our state rural development directors. Through those conversations, we've certainly learned a lot about what some of the unique needs of rural communities are in this issue and responding to this crisis. But I think perhaps more importantly, what we have been able to learn is those promising innovations from rural leaders in prevention and treatment and recovery. We are taking that information and using it to inform our own initiatives going forward, but also sharing that out with our rural partners, again, through that interactive map that we have on our Opioids webpage. We're also compiling or building a community action guide that will be released in the new year. So with that, I want to close with sharing some wisdom that I have learned so far in serving rural America during the midst of the opioid crisis. And these are lessons that I believe are applicable, if you will, to that broader challenge of rural stress, and which may touch some of the other serious concerns that you see in your own communities, such as suicide. First, I have learned that the assets in rural America to engage in this battle may be surprising. So it's important to remain open and to be creative when you go into a community and see what there is to work with. A great example of this is we had a roundtable in Pennsylvania back in March, and there I met an individual who runs a hospital foundation in Mercer County, Pennsylvania. This is a rural county along the Pennsylvania-Ohio border. Stigma is a big issue in this community, and so there the hospital launched a 3-year initiative that's really designed to open up a community conversation about the disease of addiction, and they're doing this through local stories. They've also, in addition to that conversation, because there's been so much interest and so much need, the hospital hired a community navigator that is helping families and businesses that are impacted by this issue help employees get connected to the resources that they need to get healthy. In addition to people struggling with addiction, the community has really become the connection point for businesses, not only in that community, but in the region, who are seeking help to support not only their employees, but the families that are impacted in their town. Secondly, I have learned that while I think we often focus on how rural areas are under-resourced, that the flip side of that, if you will, is that a small step of action, because it is a small area, can have a big impact in rural communities, particularly when the right leaders are engaged. Positive activity can go viral. I've seen this firsthand in rural Maryland, in Talbot County. There, this county has launched what they call Talbot Goes Purple campaign. It's a local Rotary that has teamed up with the sheriff, the county school system, and a local community foundation. And they have been able to launch a very successful community awareness campaign about substance misuse, all using the color purple. They have everything from shirts to towels at sporting events. They even have street lights throughout the community that have been changed out to use a purple bulb. Local leaders there are truly painting the town purple to drive that community conversation about the danger of opioids and other addictive substances. This has been such a success that other counties in Maryland and now other states are even looking at to copy this campaign. And I think something like this could easily be reshaped to address another facet of rural stress, such as depression or farm suicide. Finally, I have learned that while we cannot deny the truly devastating nature of this issue for so many rural places, I believe that there is a bright spot, if you will, in this story, which we cannot afford to miss. I know I've seen firsthand in my travels that for some communities, the tragedy that this issue presents can become a powerful catalyst for broader change. It often brings community members together to tackle difficult but underlying challenges in their town that need to be addressed regardless of the drugs to set their town on a path for prosperity. In my home state of Indiana, there's a community there, Scott County, that has been deeply impacted by this issue. And I've had an opportunity really to get to know many of the local leaders there. And the difficulty that this issue has brought to the surface has really propelled those leaders to come together and tackle some of the tough challenges there, such as infrastructure development, job creation, and workforce training. And in that, I find a great hope and a huge opportunity for all of us as rural leaders to use what is otherwise at times a very dark valley to be a critical turning point in the future of rural America. So I don't know what brings you here this week, whether you have a story like Mary in your own community, or because the fabric of your once quiet town has been reshaped by the power of addiction. But I want you to know that as you move from learning and networking yesterday and today and into action in your town, that we at USDA are committed to stand with you as your partner in building healthy rural communities now and for generations to come. Thank you.